Attention, attention, this is History Lost in Time. And welcome to episode 73 of the History Lost in Time podcast. This podcast is available in German and English and can be found on YouTube, Spotify, Podcast.de, Blue Sky and Instagram. There's also a music-based partner project on YouTube called HLIT AI Music. The topic of this episode. In this episode, I'll be introducing Chancellor Heinrich Brüning. For a long time, the question was raised whether he was the first gravedigger of the Weimar Republic or its last hope. I would argue that both are true. He was its first gravedigger, but also its last hope. However, a Weimar Republic that survived under Brüning would have had a completely different character, but more on that later. Political agenda and background. This episode is particularly important to me personally. It was the first episode on my old YouTube channel, and back then I made a mistake I'd like to point out now. My mistake was that I read Heinrich Brüning's memoirs first and was therefore heavily influenced by his perspective and justifications. This somewhat distorted my understanding of him, so my advice to everyone is read a neutral text about a person before turning to their memoirs. Then the gaps and embellishments will become very obvious. The sources that were used. Source 1. Bernd Braun, The Chancellors of the Weimar Republic, Kohlhammer Publishing House, Stuttgart 2013. Source 2. Hans Mommsen, Rise and Fall of the Weimar Republic, 1918-33, Ullstein Propyläen, Berlin, 1998. Source 3. Nadine Rossol and Benjamin Ziemann, Upheaval and Abyss, The Handbook of the Weimar Republic, WBG, Darmstadt 2021. And as usual, supplementary online sources. Heinrich Brüning was born in Münster on November 26, 1885. He was thus younger than West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, who took office 17 years after Brüning. Brüning was the latest born Chancellor of the Weimar Republic, just 44 years old when he took office. His father owned a wine shop and a vinegar distillery, but died when Heinrich was only a year and a half old. He was therefore raised by his mother and older siblings and was called Harry as a child. He had a particularly close relationship with his older sister, who died in 1955. His father's death had no negative impact on Brüning's education. He attended grammar school and graduated in 1904. He was a good student, though somewhat frail. At the age of 7, he suffered from myocarditis and was therefore exempt from sports for the rest of his school career. After finishing school, he studied for an exceptionally long time and in a wide variety of subjects. At the universities of Munich and Strasbourg, he studied law, philosophy, history, and political science. Due to crippling exam anxiety, he was only able to complete his studies in 1911. He then spent 2 years traveling abroad, gathering material for his doctoral dissertation, which he completed in 1915 at the University of Bonn in the field of economics. Keep in mind, he was already 30 years old at that point, and the First World War had been raging for a year. After completing his doctoral dissertation, he became a soldier and served primarily on the Western Front until 1918. He participated in the battles of the Somme, Arras, and Cambrai. His final stint was in a machine gun sniper unit. At the end of the war, he was a captain in the reserves and a recipient of the Iron Cross first and second class. He recounts this in more detail in his memoirs, which I have before me, and I will also share more about when the opportunity arises. After the war, he began working at the Secretariat for Social Student Work, but after a few months switched to an advisory position of the Center Party politician and Prussian Minister of Welfare Adam Stegerwald. In 1921, he took over the management of the Christian German Trade Union Federation. He remained active there until January 1930. His Catholic upbringing instilled in him an early inclination towards the Centre Party. However, he only became politically active after the end of the First World War. His memoirs clearly reveal his highly critical stance towards the November Revolution of 1918 and the Weimar Republic as a whole. This likely makes him the Centre Party Chancellor who was the most detached from the Republic. Further quotations suggest that he felt a certain affinity for opponents of the Republic, but more on that when I present his memoirs. In May 1924 he was elected to the Reichstag for the first time. He was considered a good, if not a brilliant orator, and became an expert on financial and tax matters. The book on the Reichs-Chancellor states on page 71, his advocacy for the social question always had a strong anti-socialist thrust. Brüning was a national conservative monarchist who found it difficult to reconcile himself with the Weimar Republic. He therefore logically struggled with the pro-Republic party leader Wilhelm Marx, whose opponent he was. When Wilhelm Marx ran against Field Marshal von Hindenburg for Reich President in 1925, Brüning struggled with campaigning for Marx and against Hindenburg. From 1929 onwards, he was considered the rising star of the Centre Party. In December 29, he became parliamentary group leader in the Reichstag. Together with the new party leader Ludwig Kaas, he signaled a clear shift to the right for the Centre Party. Kaas was considered a national authoritarian who had also spoken very disparagingly about the foreign policy of the German People's Party DVP leader Gustav Stresemann. From 1929 onward, efforts were underway in President Hindenburg's inner circle to form a cabinet without the SPD. While President Hindenburg was generally satisfied with Chancellor Müller, the SPD itself was repugnant to him and especially to his inner circle. The idea was to form a minority government ranging from the DDP to the DNVP, making it dependent on the president's confidence. The Reichstag was to be deliberately weakened and the president strengthened. The government should implement laws by using Article 48, the emergency decree. The development of the Republic was to shift away from parliamentarianism and toward more authoritarian structures. Hindenburg's inner circle sought suitable men willing to embark on such a path. Behind the back of the incumbent chancellor, with whom the Centre Party was in coalition, Brüning participated in these discussions and declared his willingness to support the plan. General von Schleicher, one of Hindenburg's closest confidants, was particularly convinced of Brüning's suitability as a candidate. The book on the Reichs-Chancellor states on page 72 that Brüning's behavior can be characterized as, quote, tactical finesse, moral flexibility, or shabbiness. The Mommsen book states on pages 343 and 344, as a former frontline officer and recipient of the Iron Cross First Class, Brüning recommended himself as Chancellor, although Hindenburg felt a certain reluctance to entrust a Catholic with the government. On March 30, 1930, 3 days after the resignation of Chancellor Hermann Müller, Heinrich Brüning assumed power. His mandate from President Hindenburg was clear: to form a cabinet independent of political parties. Brüning formed a revival of the bourgeois bloc government, an alliance of the Centre Party, the German National People's Party DNVP, the German People's Party DVP, the Democratic Party DDP, and the Bavarian People's Party BVP. Lacking a majority, the coalition was dependent on the president's confidence and vulnerable to votes of no confidence from the Reichstag. From the outset, Brüning invoked Article 48, the emergency decree, to circumvent the Reichstag's influence and advance his national conservative agenda. While this may have seemed like a revival of the bourgeois minority cabinets of the early 20s under President Ebert, there was a crucial difference. Back then, these had been stopgap measures, not planned instruments intended to alter the character of the Republic. Because these political instruments had already existed, people didn't view this development quite so critically at the time. However, with this agenda, Brüning took a decisive first step toward the end of the Weimar Republic and toward a more authoritarian order. In his memoirs, Brüning presents this somewhat differently. He places the point at which he was ready to lead the government further back, but letters from his associates prove that this is inaccurate. The problem with Article 48 was that a simple majority in the Reichstag was sufficient to repeal emergency legislation. The SPD and KPD alone held 207 of the 491 seats in the Reichstag and were both opposed to Brüning. Therefore, on April 1st, 1930, Brüning quite explicitly threatened the two left-wing factions with the dissolution of the Reichstag. On page 107 of the Reichs-Chancellor's book, he is quoted as saying, "This cabinet has been formed with the purpose of solving, as is generally agreed, the tasks vital to the Reich's survival in the shortest possible time. It will be the last attempt to implement this solution with this Reichstag." The government hoped to secure a majority for a bourgeois bloc government through new elections and to weaken the political left. Due to the clearly visible control of the government by the president's inner circle, Brüning's government was dubbed the Hindenburg cabinet very early on. SPD parliamentary group leader Breitscheid recognized early on where this was headed. In a speech before the Reichstag, he said he was convinced that Brüning had good reason to believe he needed Article 48 for his legislation, but that the Chancellor was working with people who pursued entirely different goals. Breitscheid would be proven right. The problem with Brüning is that he was a loner who didn't even reveal his true intentions to his inner circle. So what was he planning? I see four possibilities. 1. He wanted the presidential cabinet with emergency decrees solely because of the current emergency situation. Germany was, after all, suffering greatly from the Great Depression. After overcoming the crisis, a return to the normal Weimar order would have been possible. This is theoretically conceivable, but based on Brüning's own statements, I consider it highly unlikely. 2. He wanted to use this approach to transform the republic into a presidential democracy with autocratic features. This is a very likely scenario that would fit well with Brüning's convictions. 3. He wanted to restore the monarchy this way. This may well have been his goal, given his openness to the monarchy, but this was unrealistic due to the realities of the early 1930s. 4. He wanted to abolish democracy and establish a dictatorship in this way. This is what ultimately happened, and it is possible that this was Brüning's plan, but it is rather unlikely, especially considering his behavior between 1930 and 32 toward the people around President Hindenburg, as well as his relationships with the SPD and the NSDAP. What was the economic situation in Germany in the spring of 1930? The Great Depression had hit hard within 9 months. Unemployment stood at over 3 million and industrial production had plummeted by a third. On June 30th, 1930, Brüning was able to celebrate a success, albeit one that had been achieved by his predecessors: the final withdrawal of Allied troops from the Rhineland. For the first time since 1918, no foreign troops remained on German soil. In July 1930, after only a few months in office, the Reichstag overturned one of Brüning's emergency decrees by a simple majority. As threatened, Brüning dissolved the Reichstag and called for new elections. The book Upheaval and Abyss states on page 115, "The decision to dissolve parliament in July 1930 was the true beginning of the end of the Weimar Republic. Not only was this a completely unnecessary abuse of presidential power, but it also marked the end of any attempt to conceal the politicians' disinterest in forming selfless coalitions." However, the outcome of the Reichstag elections of September 1930 did not at all correspond to the expectations of Brüning and the Hindenburg circle. Although the SPD suffered significant losses, falling from nearly 30 to 24.5%, the governing parties also suffered losses. The Centre Party and the Bavarian People's Party (BVP) were able to roughly maintain their results, but the German Democratic Party (DDP) fell below 4%. Even worse, the German National People's Party (DNVP) and the German People's Party (DVP) halved their results, falling to 7 and 4.5% respectively. Even the right-wing economic parties suffered slight losses. So who won? On the one hand, the Communist Party of Germany (KPD) increased its share of the vote by 2.5% to 13.1, making it the fourth strongest party. However, the big winner was Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party (NSDAP), which jumped from less than 3 to 18.3%, becoming the second strongest party. Of the 577 seats in the Reichstag, the Brüning government, comprised of the Centre Party, the BVP, the DDP and the DVP, held only 137. The DNVP, which had left the government, had 41 seats. The SPD, KPD and NSDAP together held 327 of the 577 seats, meaning a government needed the support of either the SPD, the KPD or the NSDAP. Although Brüning managed to secure the support of some splinter parties, this did not change the fundamental balance of power. Why did the DNVP leave the government? After all, President Hindenburg and his circle were very close to the DNVP in spirit. This was mainly due to personal reasons. During the election campaign, the DNVP had split into a moderate wing under Count von Westarp and a radical anti-democratic wing under Alfons Hugenberg. While Westarp favored cooperation within the government, Hugenberg opted for fundamental opposition and collaboration with the Nazis. The moderate wing founded the very weak Conservative People's Party, which continued to participate in the Brüning government. But the remaining Hugenberg DNVP now opposed Brüning. The men of Hindenburg's circle rejected Hugenberg for personal reasons and therefore continued to support Brüning. The left-wing parties, the SPD and KPD, had focused their efforts on attacking the resurgent Nazi Party during the election campaign. It had been apparent beforehand that the Nazis would gain significant ground. Their propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels, had led a surprisingly modern and dynamic campaign, which ultimately made the high result possible. The immediate consequence of the elections was a withdrawal of short-term foreign loans, which exacerbated the already difficult economic situation. In December 1930, 4.4 million people were unemployed. This figure rose to 5.66 million by December 1931 and peaked in 1932 at over 6 million, a rate of over 30%, meaning that 1 in 3 people in the country was unemployed. Industrial production continued to decline and in 1932-33 was more than 40% below pre-crisis levels. Steel production had even fallen by 65%. It's important to understand that unemployment back then was different from unemployment today. Social benefits were significantly lower and unemployment could quickly lead to impoverishment, homelessness and hunger. During this period, special warming centers were set up in winter so that people who were homeless or couldn't afford fuel to heat their homes could at least warm up for a few hours. Public meals were offered here and there to alleviate the famine. For example, the German army distributed soup publicly. The Reichs-Chancellor's book states on page 108, given the comparatively low level of social support, this meant mass misery. This development was not caused, but massively exacerbated by the economic and financial policies of the Reich government. This brings us to the core of Brüning's government policy, the measures taken to combat the crisis. What exactly did the government do? In October 31, Brüning told the Reichstag that there were no easy ready-made solutions, but only a long and arduous path that had to be followed step by step. Brüning pursued a deflationary policy. He cut pensions, reduced civil servant salaries, cut social benefits, raised taxes, and drastically reduced the state budget. Why did he do that? Brüning believed that mismanagement had occurred at many levels of the state and that Prussian thrift had been ignored. Mommsen's book explains this briefly and succinctly on page 350. For Brüning, there was not the slightest doubt that a fundamental reduction in public spending, and in particular a drastic curtailment of unemployment insurance benefits, was necessary. His primary goal was to restore political sovereignty by ending reparations. He wanted to prove to the outside world that Germany was collapsing and becoming impoverished under the burden of reparations. Because of the importance of the German economy in Europe, neighboring European states were also suffering. It would therefore be in their own interest to advocate for the recovery of the German economy. Brüning readily accepted the impoverishment of large segments of the population. He was even able to exploit this in his negotiations. According to Brüning's plan, Germany had to appear so devastated, yet continue paying, that even the most oblivious would realize the situation was untenable. His plan was then to start from a low base and achieve economic recovery before all other nations. Brüning stubbornly maintained this course throughout his entire term in office, no matter how much the situation deteriorated. He was therefore also called the Hunger Chancellor. Mommsen's book states on pages 356-57, this perspective, maintained by Brüning with almost doctrinary rigidity, was linked to a pronounced nationalistic stance, undisguised monarchist leanings, and a conservative conception of the state oriented towards old Prussian virtues and prejudices. Just as he viewed the revolution of 1918-19 as an avoidable catastrophe, he saw the Weimar Constitution as a political form imposed from the outside, incompatible with German state tradition. From mid-1931 onward, calls for a change of course and a state-funded investment program to stimulate the economy grew louder. Brüning refused, saying that this would only make sense at the lowest point of the crisis. However, his economic policies led to ever new lows and exacerbated the crisis. In July 31, Brüning achieved his first foreign policy success. Due to an initiative by US President Herbert Hoover, a one-year moratorium was declared, postponing all international payment obligations. But how did he intend to implement all of this domestically? After all, he didn't even have a remotely close majority in the Reichstag, and a simple majority in the Reichstag could still overturn his emergency decrees. Brüning scheduled increasingly longer recesses, during which the Reichstag simply didn't convene. At the same time, he made agreements with the SPD, which promised to abstain from voting. The SPD swallowed this bitter pill, fearing that otherwise Hitler would become Chancellor. And as much as they disliked Brüning, they preferred him to Hitler. In the medium term, however, Brüning wanted to restructure the constitution in an authoritarian way, so that he would no longer have to cooperate with the SPD. Brüning held talks with both the SPD and the Nazis, exploring the possibilities of cooperation. He wanted to test coalitions between the Center Party and the NSDAP at the state level, but initially keep the Nazis out of national politics. Hitler, however, refused this, and therefore no cooperation materialized. From 1931 onward, Germany's political landscape was fundamentally different. The Reichstag rarely convened, and when it did, no votes were held that had any real impact. Laws were enacted directly by the government, 43 emergency decrees in 31 alone. In effect, Germany was already an autocratic republic without a functioning parliament. Brüning justified this by claiming that the Reichstag was dysfunctional anyway and that the emergency situation left no other option. Furthermore, he saw himself as the last bulwark against the extremists from the Nazis and the communists. While this may have been true to some extent, he had consciously chosen this path. And now he was entirely dependent on the Reich President and his inner circle, because he absolutely could not rely on the Reichstag. In Mommsen's book on pages 357-58 it says, Brüning would never understand that he, who had risen to the chancellery through intriguing personal connections, was not a victim of malicious rivals in his downfall, but rather of the political circumstances he himself had helped to shape. How did Brüning appear to those around him? In short, ascetic, intellectual, and unassuming. He excelled in his expertise and attention to detail, but repeatedly irritated those around him and came across as hurtful and cold. He was not a politician who appealed to the people, and he preferred to make decisions behind closed doors rather than in the public eye. He considered a functioning administration more important than parliamentarianism. Often even his ministers didn't know what he was actually planning. Nevertheless, he radiated a kind of optimism and was tactically astute. In 30 and 31, Germany and Austria joined forces and attempted to establish a customs union. Both countries hoped this would provide economic relief during difficult times. However, the project met with massive resistance from France, Italy, and Czechoslovakia. Great Britain was also skeptical. This was partly due to poor communication from the German government, which had announced the project to the world in a surprise manner. There were fears that Germany could achieve economic hegemony in Central and Eastern Europe, and that the customs union would be the first step towards the annexation of Austria by the German Reich, something prohibited by the peace treaties. Through economic pressure, France succeeded in halting the project. Foreign Minister Curtius, who had strongly advocated for it, was subsequently unable to remain at his post. The failure also undermined confidence in Germany and Austria in diplomatic solutions. The economic coercion that followed led to a banking crisis in Austria and Germany, which further exacerbated the economic situation. Instead of improving the situation, the customs union project had therefore caused massive economic and foreign policy damage and had also tarnished Brüning's reputation with Reich President Hindenburg. Under pressure from Hindenburg, Brüning had to reshuffle his cabinet in October 31 after this disaster, dismissing numerous too democratic politicians, such as Joseph Wirth, and replacing them with more right-wing politicians. Brüning's second cabinet consisted primarily of politicians from the Centre Party, the German Democratic Party DDP, respectively the State Party, the Bavarian People's Party BVP, right-wing splinter parties, and unaffiliated individuals, and lasted for another 9 months. In the spring of 32, President Hindenburg's term of office finally came to an end. The Nazi Party nominated Adolf Hitler as its presidential candidate. Hindenburg was supported in this election by the Republican parties, from the Social Democratic Party SPD to the German Democratic Party DDP, and was seen as a guarantor against Hitler and the dictatorship. The 84-year-old allowed himself to be elected by this alliance, but he personally resented Brüning, who had campaigned heavily for the president, for having been elected by Social Democrats and Catholics, rather than by his actual political allies. Hitler garnered around 36% of the vote, thus indicating the Nazi Party's potential in new elections. From this point on, Brüning warned against the idea of further new elections. Without governmental responsibility, the Nazi Party could continue to ride the populist wave and thus achieve excellent election results. However, his warnings were increasingly ignored. On April 13, 1932, the Brüning government banned the SR and the SS after numerous violent clashes. This sparked protests within the Reichswehr, which viewed both organizations as a kind of recruitment pool for the army, and also from the Reich President, who considered this measure too one-sided and would have preferred to ban other paramilitary groups as well. Brüning and his Interior Minister Groener had clearly underestimated the political backlash. With all these steps, Brüning had become quite unpopular with the Reich president, and Hindenburg's inner circle, particularly his son Oskar, State Secretary Meissner, and General von Schleicher, were actively intriguing and seeking a replacement for Brüning. In May 32, Brüning finally fell from power over a bill that would have cut aid for the Junkers, the wealthy landowners east of the Elbe, and settled new farmers on the land of bankrupt landowners. Personally affected and furious about this measure, Hindenburg considered it agricultural Bolshevism. When General von Schleicher presented Franz von Papen as Brüning's replacement, Hindenburg was persuaded, and Brüning was dismissed at the end of May 32. In Mommsen's book on page 523, it states, Brüning himself attributed his downfall to Schleicher's intrigues, but these merely expressed the long-standing tendency of the forces supporting the presidential regime to definitely break away from the parliamentary system and to politically neutralize not only the KPD, but also the SPD and the free trade unions. Decisively, Brüning had gradually paved the way for the undivided rule of the right wing and provided the legal or pseudo-legal foundations for it. In principle, Brüning had created a system that was even less democratic than the German Empire. In the German Empire, the emperor appointed and dismissed the chancellor, more or less at his own discretion. This was also the case now, but it was the president of the Reich who appointed the chancellor. In the German Empire, the Reichstag passed laws and approved the budget. Now everything was handled by emergency decrees, and the Reichstag was more or less completely paralyzed and bypassed. The only democratic improvement compared to the German Empire was the election of the Reichstag and the Reich president. Although, what good are elections for the Reichstag if the Reichstag does nothing or can do nothing? After his dismissal, Brüning remained active in a leading position within the Centre Party. His reparations policy proved successful under his successor Franz von Papen, as the reparations were abolished with a final payment at the Lausanne Conference in 1932. Following the July 32 elections, talks between the Centre Party and the Nazi Party resumed, in which Brüning participated. However, Hitler refused to share power with others, insisting on an all-or-nothing approach. In the spring of 1933, Brüning argued against Hitler's Enabling Act, but ultimately yielded to party discipline and voted in favor. In May 1933, he became the last chairman of the Centre Party and dissolved the party 2 months later to preempt a ban by the Nazi regime. In May 1934, he fled Germany after receiving word that he was in personal danger. After stays in the Netherlands, Switzerland and Great Britain, he settled in the United States. From 1939 onwards, he worked at Harvard University in the field of political science. During World War II, he advised the US government behind the scenes regarding Germany. However, he did not work openly for the Allies, but instead attempted to establish contact with conservative resistance circles and to make the idea of a possible different Germany after Hitler's downfall palatable to the Allies. Because he advocated for a negotiated peace and against Germany's surrender, the US did not consider him a suitable candidate for a political position in post-war Germany. After 1945, he was unable to regain a foothold in Germany, neither personally nor politically. He was unpopular with his former colleagues from the Centre Party, who were now predominantly active in the CDU-CSU, and his views seemed outdated and out of touch. At a meeting with Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, the latter expressed his hope that Brüning would not remain in Germany. Nevertheless, the former chancellor worked at the University of Cologne from 1951 to 55. When his sister died, he felt so isolated that he returned to the USA and spent his later years in a modest house in Norwich, Vermont. He considered the political situation in Bonn hopeless and Adenauer's foreign policy misguided. He argued against the party system, against alignment with the West, and in favor of a neutral Germany between the blocs. He died on March 3, 1970, the last of the Weimar chancellors to pass away. At his own request, he was buried in the family grave in Münster. Upon the arrival of his body at Cologne-Bonn Airport, he was honored by then-Chancellor Willy Brandt, former Chancellor Kurt Georg Kiesinger, and future Chancellor Helmut Schmidt. His posthumously published memoirs surprised and disappointed historians, as they had not anticipated his unequivocally anti-parliamentarian and pro-monarchist views. More on this when I discuss the memoirs. A few words about his private life. Brüning remained unmarried, without relationships or children throughout his life. His siblings lived similarly. His brother, for example, was a Catholic priest and his sister worked in social services. Brüning lived a very ascetic and detached life, practically celibate like a priest, a career path his mother had recommended. However, Brüning had moments when he regretted this way of life. A letter from August 35 contains the following passage, quoted from the Reichs-Chancellor's book, page 144. Why have I been rushing through life since 1914, always fighting, almost without pleasure, often very lonely, instead of marrying happily and not worrying daily about the fate of my country? His closest confidants were his friends, President Hindenburg, his sister, his goddaughter, and his assistant Claire Nix, who had worked for him since 1940 and became his closest confidant from 1955 onward. She was simultaneously housekeeper, gardener, chauffeur, reader, nurse, co-editor of his publications, etc. A few finishing words. For many, Brüning is considered a precursor to Hitler. Others see him as the country's last chance against Hitler. Not in the form of the Weimar Republic, however, but rather a more authoritarian presidential republic that might have somehow formed itself after surviving the Great Depression. Brüning's governance was heavily aligned with the priorities of the right-wing elites, and his actions accelerated the demise of the Weimar Republic. However, in the early 1930s, right-wing circles still suffered from the same overconfidence as in previous decades, and moreover had no idea what the situation in the country was really like. They overestimated the appeal of their own plans, didn't understand the plight of the average citizen, and therefore acted blindly and without any knowledge of the actual circumstances. From the government of Franz von Papen onward, they relied solely on the Hugenberg DNVP, a party polling at 7%, believing they could win over bourgeois voters, harness the Nazi movement to their cause, and contain the left-wing SPD and KPD parties. From the spring of 32, Brüning was no longer authoritarian enough for them, so they abandoned him. Brüning took steps away from the parliamentary procedures of the Weimar Republic and toward an authoritarian government. He accustomed the German people to the idea that laws came from the top of the government, not from parliament, and propagated the notion that parliament was incapable of acting and that critical problems could not be solved democratically. In doing so, he paved the way, albeit probably unintentionally, for the authoritarian governments of Papen and Schleicher, and ultimately for Hitler's dictatorship. His support for Hindenburg and his opposition to Hitler in the spring of 32 demonstrate that he did not want to take the path to dictatorship, but by then it was already too late. While his successors Papen and Schleicher acted like political gamblers, Brüning was the cool accountant of decline. He ruled not with passion, but with decrees and spreadsheets. Brüning's tragedy lies in his sense of duty. He considered himself the last bulwark against Hitler, yet it was he who raised the drawbridge of democracy and flooded the moat with emergency decrees, a moat through which, in the end, only a dictator could cross. One cannot accuse Brüning of lacking a goal. His problem was that his goal remained in the 19th century, while he attempted to solve the problems of the 20th century with the social coldness of a Prussian bureaucrat. In the end, Brüning can be portrayed as a captain who burned all the lifeboats in a storm because he believed that was the only way to discipline the crew, and who was then surprised that the sailors brought the first pirate on board who promised them bread and circuses. Thank you. This was History Lost in Time.